Okay, everybody, this is our first news and views in the year 2014. We are now 2 years beyond Thunderdome. The apocalypse is on hold, but we are still going at it on news and views. This is January 2nd, 2014, and I'm Joseph P. Farrell, and space, as you can tell probably from the last few news and views, has been on my mind, and it still is. And I have an update that I want to make about that spaceport story, and particularly the one in Oklahoma, because a lot of you, including a gentleman that lives in Oklahoma, sent me a bunch of information about this spaceport. Now, the one gentleman in Oklahoma pointed out something very interesting, and that was, in his opinion, that the spaceport was part of some sort of huge state government scam, money laundering thing, and so on and so forth. Now, folks, I've lived in Oklahoma, and that wouldn't surprise me, to be quite frank with you. But there is more about that spaceport in Burns Flat, Oklahoma, that I want to share, kind of update, correct some things, impressions, and so on. I have an article from the Space Review, and I'll link this in the YouTube and on the website. And the spaceport itself is at exit 53 on Interstate 40 in Oklahoma to Burns Flat. All right. It is the former Clinton Sherman Air Base. Now, the interesting thing is recently on the Bite Show, before I got a hold of this article, I mentioned the fact that the runway is so extraordinarily long, and in this article it states that the runway is 4,115 meters long. That works out to about 13,500 feet, which is the figure I was quoting before. But again, that's a very, very long runway, and it's on the scale, it's on the same order as that famous long runway at Area 51. It's about 2 miles long, if not longer. Now, the Air Force abandoned this facility over 3 decades ago, but in 1954, this is the significant thing about this article. In 1954, the Air Force lengthened the runway to its current size to accommodate B-52s, which were apparently based there. So that's the origin of the long runway. All right. Now, the spaceport itself, the article goes on to explain that the idea was cooked up in Oklahoma to make use out of this old abandoned air base because of the existing infrastructure and so on there. So, in other words, six of one, half a dozen of the other. I still think that in the main we have a story here about spaceports around the country that are gradually being developed and that we're looking at something being rolled out. Now, with that in mind, I wanted to go to two articles that were brought to my attention that I think are rather significant. And again, I'm going to indulge in my normal high octane speculation here, folks, to kick off the new year. Because this year is the 100th anniversary of the beginning of World War I, the war to end all wars, and it's also significant from the stories that we see developing. It's an election year in the United States again. And space is going to be a part of the news. Now, one article in particular was brought to my attention by Ms. KM, all right? And this one is, I'm going to link this as well. This is a front page of the Space Settlement Institute. Now, when you go to this website, what you see is a very nicely done sort of professional website, all right, that's billing itself as kind of a grassroots website, all right. I don't think it is. I think this is a kind of a front, perhaps, or perhaps there's people involved that are working for other groups and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that the website itself is a front. I'm just saying that it has a look to it that's kind of peculiar. And it states that it itself is, quote, a non-profit association founded to help promote the human colonization and settlement of outer space. It is our belief that private industry, not government, must assume the lead in space settlement efforts. The Institute's mission includes identification of financial and other incentives to motivate private industry to fulfill such a role. And now listen carefully. quote, the removal of regulatory, legal, and psychological barriers to private efforts in space. The Institute has identified lunar land claims recognition, a law that would recognize the right of private lunar settlements to claim and resell the land around their base as the necessary first step to incentivize permanent human habitation on the moon. Now, I'm gonna stop the quotation there, because what you see now is an organization is formed to lobby for the establishment in law, in presumably in international law, but I would also imagine in the national laws of the various space powers, Russia, China, India, Japan, Brazil, the United States, and the various European countries. All right. What they're lobbying for is a change in the law that would allow land itself to be bought and privately held on other planets as a first step to create the necessary climate of culture for privatization of space. This is a huge and significant thing, folks, because this would require, if my memory serves me correctly, some amendment to international treaties that were laid down in the 50s and 60s, largely between the United States and the Soviet Union, which were the only space powers at the time. Now, this is significant because it's part of the call that we've been watching kind of closely the last couple of years here on the website for mining of extraterrestrial resources, of asteroids, and so on. Now we have a claim to a sweeping proposal in international law. In other words, law itself will recognize not only mineral rights, but now something much more significant, property rights. All right. I suspect that because of that, that there are players or agencies or forces backing this group, and those forces may be various space agencies, particularly in the West. It may be people, the corporations that have been pushing for mining of asteroids and so on and so forth. It's a very, very significant development. Now, on another front, something equally interesting is happening, and this is a story that was reported and filed on December 30th, 2013, so just a couple of days ago. And the headline here is, quote, NASA budget may shut down Cassini and Mars Curiosity, unquote. Now, let me read the first paragraph of this for you. Curiosity, incidentally, is that probe that landed in the crater on Mars and has been taking the rather interesting pictures. So in other words, this is one of the flagship missions. Cassini, of course, is the NASA probe that's gone to Saturn and that has been photographing some very, very interesting anomalous things in the rings of Saturn, more or less on the line of Norman R. Berggrun's Ringmakers of Saturn. Huge, huge things that we don't know what they are. They look like electrical arcs and so on. But be that as it may, listen to this, quote, Cassini, or pardon me, the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration might put an end to the Cassini and Mars Curiosity missions due to budget cuts. Cassini is an unmanned spacecraft sent to study the planet Saturn and its natural satellites, which has a yearly allocation of $60 million, while Curiosity is also a rover sent to study Mars to see if it once supported life, which has a yearly allocation of $50 million. Science Recorder reported that the funding for these space missions will be reduced by 50% in 2014 and then half again in 2015. That means by 2015, the missions will have a $15 million and $12 million allocation respectively. Continuing the missions will be impossible with such amounts. NASA Administrator Charles Bolden shocked the entire scientific community when he announced Friday that the launch of the flagship missions will be put on hold. In other words, flagship missions are like Curiosity and the Cassini mission. They're missions that cost over $1 billion. those types of missions are going to be put on hold, and the current two big flagship missions, Curiosity and Cassini, will have their budgets slashed dramatically, making it unfeasible for those missions to continue. That's the news. Now, let me engage in some high-octane speculation here. It defies all common sense and rationality that the United States government would have spent so much money on these two missions that are finding out a great deal about those two planets suddenly and altogether to stop them. All right, even with the disaster that is happening economically in the country because of various decisions of the current administration. We won't go into what they are. Even with that, it defies rationality that these two missions would simply be shut off due to budgetary constraints. Now, I suspect what's going on, if you allow me to indulge my high-octane speculation, is that these two missions are indeed finding things, and that it's a convenient way for NASA once again to deny information to the public by claiming budget cuts, by pretending to turn the switch to the off position, while in fact that switch is still on. But the funding problem is real. So in other words, I'm suggesting that these two missions are going to be quietly rolled into, from NASA missions, into the black budget, into the black projects world. That the funding for those missions will remain, but it's going to start coming from the black projects world. That's what I think is going to happen here. And the reason I think this, again, I made reference to this at the beginning of this news and views. Cassini started sending back very clear pictures of very strange things in Saturn's rings or taking place around Saturn's rings. Things that resemble the claims of Norman Berggren in his famous Ringmakers of Saturn book, or infamous, depending on your point of view. In that book, he was pointing out similar anomalies in Saturn's rings, and he was coming to the conclusion that these things are spaceships of some sort. Well, that may or may not be. My point here is that Cassini was photographing similar things and posting them on NASA with great clarity. All right, these things, there were no blurs in it. You could see very clearly that something was going on. So I suspect that to head off any wild, high-octane speculation, what we see now is yet another attempt to take two very crucial missions out of NASA's hands, roll it into black budget financing, and once that occurs, it does become a national security issue. Now, that doesn't mean that NASA isn't already a part of the Department of Defense. We can thank Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra for pointing out in their book Dark Mission years ago that when NASA was established, it was established as a component or as a unit of the defense establishment to begin with. So this idea of a civilian agency was somewhat questionable from the outset. But now I think we have a clear indicator that budget cuts are going to be the excuse. And this is happening, let us note the context, this is all happening at the same time that we see much increased talk about asteroid mining, mineral rights and claims on the moon, privatization of space, and now with the Space Settlement Institute, the claims or the push to change law about property rights and being able to own actual land, not just mineral rights, on celestial bodies. So things are happening relatively quickly, and putting all that into context, yes, I think we're going to see more about spaceports popping up in the news here and there. Anyway, something to watch for this year, folks. I want to take this opportunity again to thank everybody for the prayers, donations, all of the articles that you have been sending to me to watch and look at, and especially for your donations, your memberships. All of you have been so gracious, and I hope that 2014 will be a wonderful year for everybody. God bless everybody, and we'll see you on the flip side.